Everyone thought she loved me. That was the lie. On camera, I was cherished. Off camera, I was managed. She understood angles better than emotions. The phone was never held too close, never too far. The light always fell gently across my face, smoothing lines that life had earned honestly. Her voice softened the moment the screen lit up, like a switch flipped inside her chest. "Mom, tell them how you're feeling," she'd say, smiling before I answered. I smiled too. That was my role. My name is Margaret Collins. For most of my life, I believed silence was a form of wisdom. I believed patience was proof of love. I believed families stayed whole not because people spoke, but because they endured. When my husband died, the house grew quiet in a way grief doesn't prepare you for. Not loud silence. The kind that settles into corners and waits. Daniel said it didn't make sense for me to live alone anymore. He said the drive worried him. The stairs worried him. The quiet worried him. "Rachel wants you close," he added, like that sealed the decision. Daniel had always been my safe place. Even as a child, he listened carefully, like words mattered. I raised him to be steady, to avoid unnecessary conflict, to value peace over pride. So when Rachel wrapped her arms around me that first day, tight, practiced, warm enough to be convincing, and said, "We'll take care of you, Mom," I let myself believe she meant it the way Daniel would. At first, everything looked exactly as it should have. Rachel scheduled weekly video calls with her parents and insisted I sit beside her each time. She placed the chair near the window so the light softened my skin. Her hand rested on my arm, always visible, always gentle, always intentional. "Margaret keeps us grounded," she'd say. I don't know what we'd do without her. People nodded, smiled, commented. Women from church said Daniel was blessed. Someone typed that I was lucky to be so loved. I learned quickly that kindness, when performed, always finds an audience. And audiences rarely wonder what happens once the screen goes dark. Behind closed doors, the house moved differently. My meals grew smaller, always explained with concern. "You don't need so much anymore," Rachel would say lightly, placing half a portion in front of me while filling Daniel's plate generously. If I reached for more, she reminded me about discipline, how important it was at my age. My medication disappeared from the kitchen shelf and reappeared in a locked drawer in her office. She said she worried I'd forget. When I asked for it, she checked the clock first. Sometimes she made me wait. Not long enough to complain. Just long enough to remember who decided things now. Even space became conditional. My favorite chair, the one my husband used to joke about, was moved to the garage because it didn't fit the new layout. Boxes appeared in my room slowly. Then stayed. Then spread. The house didn't feel smaller. I did. If I mentioned anything, Rachel smiled thinly. "We're just trying to stay organized." Daniel didn't notice. Or maybe noticing felt inconvenient. He worked long hours, came home tired, grateful that someone else was handling things. When I tried to explain, he waved it away gently, like brushing dust from a table. "She means well, Mom. She's just stressed." That sentence followed me everywhere. Our grandson Noah noticed before anyone admitted it. Children always do. He stopped asking me for things directly. If he wanted a snack, his eyes went to his mother first. When I offered him a cookie, he hesitated, glancing toward the hallway even when Rachel wasn't there. When she wasn't watching, he took it quickly. The next day, he did the same thing again. He wasn't afraid. He was careful. I told myself this was adjustment. That age required compromise. That making things easier for Daniel mattered more than my comfort. I had survived worse by staying quiet. I believed endurance was dignity, and dignity didn't need witnesses. The video calls continued uninterrupted. Rachel never missed one. Hair brushed. Voice warm. She positioned me exactly where I belonged, visible, agreeable, smiling. "Smile, Margaret," she whispered once, just before the screen lit up. And I did. Praise poured in. Hearts. Comments. Validation. Someone said Daniel had the perfect family. Rachel laughed modestly and replied, "We're just doing our best." When the call ended, the warmth vanished with the screen. Rachel stood, already scrolling, already elsewhere. No follow-up questions. No concern. Just the quiet hum of a house where my presence was curated, not welcomed. I began noticing patterns. My name was spoken gently only when others could hear. Concern always arrived carrying control. Daniel's calendar stayed full, appointments, reminders, responsibilities, managed carefully. Mine did not. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I watched. I listened. I stored moments carefully without writing them down, like placing fragile things on a shelf I might need later. I told myself patience would be rewarded. I believed if I stayed quiet enough, small enough, the discomfort would pass. That belief cracked during a call I almost missed. Rachel adjusted the camera and laughed softly. She's doing amazing. Honestly, she barely needs help anymore. Her fingers tightened on my shoulder as she said it. Just slightly. Just enough. I smiled on cue. Comments flooded in again. Praise. Approval. Relief. And for the first time, the smile felt heavier than the silence. For the first time, I didn't wonder how to endure it. I wondered who this performance was really for. The calls always ended the same way, with a soft laugh, a careful wave, and the screen going dark like a curtain falling after a performance everyone applauded. And every time that curtain fell, something else disappeared with it. Something small enough to be missed, but heavy enough to leave a mark. The warmth left the room the second the audience did, not abruptly, not rudely, but efficiently, like a system returning to standby, and Rachel stood up without looking at me, already stacking plates, already checking messages, already done playing her part. I stayed seated longer than necessary because standing felt like confirming that the version of me people cared about had clocked out. My smile loosened slowly, not dropping, just fading, as if it had been borrowed and needed to be returned gently, and when I finally stood, the room felt slightly off, like furniture had shifted an inch closer while I wasn't paying attention. Dinner came late that night, late enough that hunger softened into something quieter, and when Rachel said she forgot, she laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that turned inconvenience into a personality trait, and Daniel shrugged, already halfway through his meal, saying it was no big deal. The soup was thinner than usual, more warm water than nourishment, and when I reached for a second ladle, Rachel paused, smiling as she suggested we wait and see how I felt, and I pulled my hand back because needing more felt like asking for permission. No one commented. Or they did, silently, and chose comfort over correction. Afterward, I noticed the boxes near my bed had crept closer again, not enough to trip over, just enough to require awareness, and the lamp I relied on was still missing, borrowed for better lighting downstairs. Its absence explained as temporary so many times it had become permanent. My medication schedule shifted once more that week, doses spaced out with concern carefully wrapped in authority, and when I asked which doctor suggested it, Rachel waved it off kindly, saying the one who actually listened, sighing as if I were being difficult by wanting clarity. Daniel overheard enough to intervene, rubbing his eyes, telling me to trust her, reminding me she handled these things, and I nodded because trust was easier than disruption. Noah began knocking before entering my room, standing in the doorway like he was waiting for clearance, explaining that his mom said it was better this way, not accusing, just reporting, the same tone he used to report rain or school delays. When I offered to help him with homework, he hesitated, eyes darting toward the hall, saying he didn't want to tire me out, repeating words that didn't belong to him but lived comfortably in his mouth. I started noticing how often Rachel narrated my needs before I could speak, how Margaret didn't really like spicy food anymore, how Margaret forgot things, how Margaret needed reminders, each sentence harmless on its own, together forming a version of me that fit neatly into the household rules. I didn't interrupt. Silence had always been my contribution. Silence kept Daniel relaxed. Silence kept the peace believable. But silence also kept shrinking, folding inward, and I told myself I was simplifying life for everyone, doing what women my age were expected to do when families evolved without asking. One morning, I went to the kitchen early, craving coffee the way I used to make it, strong and familiar, and found the old machine gone, replaced by a sleek one with instructions taped to the side in Rachel's handwriting. I read them twice, followed them wrong anyway, drank it thin and bitter without complaint, and when Rachel walked in, she glanced at the cup and smiled sympathetically, saying it took time, that she'd handle it next time, not cruel, just conclusive. Later that afternoon, Sitting alone in the backyard, the chair wobbling slightly beneath me, I thought about the one I used to sit in, the one moved for space, for flow, for reasons that always made sense to someone else, and I realized I wasn't angry. Which surprised me, because what settled instead felt steadier, like awareness without urgency. That evening brought another call, another careful setup. Rachel adjusting my collar, reminding me to sit straighter, whispering smile as her fingers lingered a moment too long, and I smiled, watching praise fill the screen, relief settle into faces that needed everything to look right. When the screen went dark again and the room returned to its quieter version, I thanked her, told Daniel I was tired, closed my door softly, and understood something without saying it aloud. Silence hadn't been protecting the family at all. It had been protecting the story, and for the first time since moving in, I didn't feel small. I felt alert, aware in a way that didn't demand action yet, but promised it would come. Everyone still believed I was being taken care of, and that belief followed me like a clean coat I was expected to wear even when it started itching at the seams, because from the outside everything looked fine, respectable, almost picture perfect. The kind of setup people casually admired before moving on with their own lives, and I let them, because correcting that picture would have required more energy than I had been allowed to keep. After the last call ended, the one where Rachel smiled just a second longer than necessary and Daniel gave my shoulder that quick, public squeeze that meant support without involvement, the house went quiet in a way that felt practiced. Like everyone already knew their next cue except me. I noticed. The days that followed didn't feel cruel, just trimmed down, edited, optimized, and that was somehow worse, because nothing looked wrong enough to question. Rachel reorganized the pantry again, clear containers, tidy labels, everything Pinterest clean, and when I reached for the crackers that sat easiest on my stomach, she stopped me gently, not sharply, just enough to redirect. Telling me those were for Noah's lunches now and handing me something else with a smile that suggested thoughtfulness. I paused. Daniel heard part of it and called from the other room that Rachel was just trying to keep things efficient, his voice tired, distracted, already halfway elsewhere. And I nodded because efficiency had become the word that covered every small erasure. Noah picked it up without meaning to, repeating what he heard like weather updates, telling me I should ask first, that his mom liked things a certain way, and I told him it was okay, because it wasn't his fault he was learning respect from rules instead of warmth. I remembered. That was when I started noticing patterns, not like a detective, nothing dramatic, just small repetitions that stacked quietly in my mind, how my name was used in sentences not meant for me, how decisions about me were explained around me, how Daniel deferred with a shrug that said he didn't have the bandwidth, and how my days were slowly being reduced into something manageable for everyone else. The medications shifted again, one pill gone, another added, and when I picked them up, the pharmacist, Mark, young enough to still sound curious instead of careful, frowned slightly and asked who had approved the change, his tone neutral, professional, not accusing. I froze for half a second. No one had asked me that in a long time. I told him my daughter-in-law handled it, and he hesitated, saying it was probably fine but he'd double-check, just to be safe. And that stayed with me longer than it should have, the idea that my body had been managed without my voice being required. I stayed quiet. A few days later, our neighbor Linda stopped by with one of her store-bought pies she always pretended was homemade, and Rachel welcomed her warmly, all laughs and compliments, talking about how closely she watched over me, how lucky Daniel was to have her support. And Linda looked at me, really looked, and asked how I was doing, not loudly, not dramatically, just softly enough that it felt real. I almost gave the safe answer. Almost. Instead, I said I was adjusting, which was true, and Linda nodded like she understood more than I'd said, like she'd heard that word before in another context. That night, lying in bed with the hallway light glowing under the door because Rachel said it was safer that way, I replayed that question, not the words, but the tone, and I realized nothing around me had changed. But something inside me had shifted just enough to notice that my silence wasn't keeping the peace, it was keeping the system intact. I stopped correcting small things after that, not out of defeat, but out of choice, letting Rachel assume I didn't notice when she moved my mail or paid bills late, letting Daniel believe everything was handled, letting the house run on autopilot while I paid attention. really paid attention to what happened when I stepped back. I watched. Rachel grew looser with her complaints, talking openly about the burden of managing everything, forgetting who might be listening. Daniel started noticing gaps he hadn't before, small inconsistencies that didn't line up with the story he'd been told. I didn't point them out. I didn't need to. If you believe elders deserve respect, not silence, please like and subscribe, because stories like this only surface when someone is willing to listen. By the end of that month, I wasn't waiting for permission anymore, not to speak, not to move, just waiting, steady and alert, because I had learned something quietly, the kind of lesson that doesn't announce itself. That when you stop filling in the gaps for people, they eventually start seeing what's missing on their own. Everyone still thought silence meant agreement, and agreement meant peace, and peace meant everything was fine, but by then I knew silence could also mean distance, the kind that lets you step back just far enough to see the whole room without being shoved into a corner of it. And once I understood that, I stopped filling the air with explanations that were never really heard. I had stopped offering updates weeks earlier, stopped trying to justify small needs as if they were inconveniences, and that quiet shift changed the temperature of the house in ways no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. Rachel noticed first, of course, because she had always been sensitive to changes that didn't belong to her. She started checking in louder, asking if I was okay only when Daniel was nearby, touching my arm with a careful tenderness that felt rehearsed, performing concern the way someone straightens a crooked picture frame when company is coming over. And Daniel responded the way he always had, relieved by the appearance of harmony, telling her she didn't need to worry so much, telling me I was lucky to have her, and I smiled because correcting him would have required words, and words were no longer my tool. What I used instead was attention. I noticed how the bills that used to come to me stopped arriving altogether, rerouted without discussion, how Rachel would summarize expenses casually at dinner like headlines instead of facts, how she used phrases like "it's all handled and don't stress about it," and how Daniel nodded along, trusting, tired, ready to move on. I noticed how Noah repeated her phrasing now, saying things like "we should stick to the plan" or "Mom says it's better this way," and I reminded myself again that children don't invent systems, they inherit them, and inheritance can be heavier than intention. One afternoon, when Rachel was out running errands she announced were urgent but somehow never urgent enough to explain, I checked the mail slot out of habit and found a notice folded thin and pushed back just far enough to be missed. Something about an overdue payment that didn't match the story I'd been told, and instead of panic, what I felt was clarity. I didn't confront. I didn't even remove it. I placed it back exactly where it was and made a note of the date in my head, because by then my memory had become sharper than any notebook, and I trusted it more than paper. That same week, Daniel mentioned, almost offhand, that Rachel seemed stressed lately. That managing everything was taking a toll on her, and there it was again, that familiar framing where control wore the costume of sacrifice, where effort replaced accountability. I told him stress does that to people, which was true, and let the conversation end, because I was done arguing against narratives that collapsed on their own. Rachel's slips grew smaller, but more frequent after that, little cracks in her efficiency, like complaining to Linda over the fence about how hard it was to keep everything organized with so many responsibilities, or sighing a little too loudly when Daniel asked a simple question, or snapping once at Noah for moving something without asking, then catching herself when she saw me watching. I said nothing. I had learned that observation unsettles people far more than argument, because it removes the stage they depend on. The pharmacist called one morning and asked to speak to me directly this time, confirming a change Rachel had requested, his tone still polite but firmer now, professional curiosity edging into concern, and when Rachel found out, she laughed it off too quickly, saying she must have misunderstood something, blaming the doctor, the system, the paperwork, anything that could absorb responsibility without pushing back. Daniel frowned, just briefly, but it was the first time I'd seen him hesitate, the first pause that wasn't filled with reassurance, and I didn't push because hesitation needs space to grow. I let that moment sit where it was, trusting it to do its own work. If you believe elders deserve respect, not silence, please like and subscribe, because stories like this don't unravel through shouting, they unravel through truth being allowed to breathe, and breathing takes time. The moment that shifted everything wasn't dramatic at all. It happened on a quiet Saturday when Rachel assumed I'd be resting and Daniel was out with Noah, and she took a call in the kitchen without realizing I could hear her from the hallway. Her voice slow, irritated, stripped of performance, talking about how ungrateful it all felt, how no one noticed what she carried, how sometimes she wondered if things would be easier if certain responsibilities weren't there anymore. She didn't use my name. She didn't need to. The absence said enough. When she hung up, she froze when she saw me, then recovered instantly, smiling, asking if I needed anything, and I told her no, and for the first time, that answer wasn't a concession, it was a boundary I didn't explain or defend. After that, the truth didn't rush, it seeped. Daniel started asking questions on his own, small ones at first, about payments, about appointments, about why certain decisions had been made without his input, and Rachel responded with irritation masked as fatigue, with comments about how she was just trying to keep things together, and that contrast, more than any accusation, began to wear thin. I stayed consistent, calm, present, no longer adjusting myself to fit a system that had never asked my permission, no longer shrinking my needs to keep the peace, and the house responded to that steadiness in subtle ways. Like conversations that paused when I entered, like explanations that suddenly became longer, like a tone that softened without being invited to. By the end of that stretch of weeks, nothing had exploded, no voices were raised, no dramatic lines were drawn, but the story everyone believed was no longer holding together the way it used to, and I understood something quietly and completely. That choosing myself didn't require a fight, it only required that I stop disappearing for the comfort of others, and once I stopped doing that, the truth no longer had to wait for permission to show itself. They used to think the truth would announce itself. That it would arrive with raised voices, slammed doors, tears that demanded to be seen. That's how stories worked on screens, how accountability was supposed to look. But real truth, I learned, rarely behaves like that. It comes quietly. It waits until the noise runs out of excuses. And then it settles in places no one thought to guard. It began without ceremony. Daniel sat at the kitchen table one evening, long after dinner had gone cold, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face. He wasn't scrolling mindlessly the way people do when they're killing time. He was going back, rechecking, opening tabs he'd never bothered with before. Statements, dates, notes that didn't align with the summaries he'd been given for years. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in that slower, heavier way recognition forms when it has nowhere to go. He didn't call my name. He didn't sigh or swear. He didn't ask Rachel anything. He just kept looking. And somehow, that restraint told me more than any confrontation ever could. Rachel sensed it before she understood it. She hovered behind him, offering explanations before questions were asked, narrating her effort the way she always had. How stressful everything was. How much she carried. How none of these details really mattered as long as the family was fine. But the word fine had lost its meaning by then. It sounded thin, like a word repeated too often to cover something hollow. Daniel asked her to slow down. Just that. To slow down. To let him see things himself. The request was reasonable, almost gentle, but it unsettled her more than anger ever could have. Because control doesn't survive inspection. It survives speed. And scrutiny has a way of stripping urgency of its authority. Over the next few days, the truth didn't explode. It aligned. The pharmacist followed up again, this time insisting Daniel be present. Dates were clarified. Adjustments were traced. Approvals were questioned. Watching Daniel's face as timelines settled into place was harder than I expected. Regret doesn't look dramatic when it's real. It looks stunned. Quiet. Like someone realizing they've been standing on unstable ground for a very long time. Linda stopped by with another pie she didn't need to bring and mentioned, casually, how much responsibility I must carry at my age. Rachel corrected her too quickly, too sharply, insisting I was well taken care of. Linda nodded politely, but the air shifted after she left. Polite nods sometimes carry more judgment than open disagreement. Even no one noticed. Children always do. One night, in the middle of a conversation no one thought he was listening to, he asked why Grandma needed permission for things he didn't. The room went still. Not because of what he said, but because no one could answer him honestly without dismantling the story they'd all agreed to live inside. I stayed where I was through all of it. I didn't present evidence. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask to be believed. I had learned something important by then. When the truth is strong enough, it doesn't need a spokesperson. It needs space. Daniel came to me one evening when the house was quiet in a way that felt real for the first time in years. He sat across from me, not towering, not distracted, just present. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Not defensive. Not rushed. He said he was sorry. Not the kind of apology meant to close a conversation. The other kind. The specific one. He named the moments he'd ignored. The assumptions he'd accepted because they were convenient. The way he'd chosen peace over presence, efficiency over attention. He didn't ask me to reassure him. He didn't ask to be forgiven quickly. So I listened. And for the first time, listening didn't cost me anything. Rachel's reckoning didn't arrive as punishment. There was no scene. No dramatic exit. No need for raised voices. Boundaries were named calmly. Responsibilities were restructured openly. Decisions were shared instead of managed. At first, she resisted, framing accountability as attack, exhaustion as excuse. But without reaction to feed on, those strategies lost their power. A system can survive anger. It can't survive clarity. The house shifted, not back to what it had been, but forward into something more honest. Care stopped being performed for an audience. Respect stopped being conditional on convenience. I didn't reclaim space with demands. I reclaimed it by existing fully in it. I made my own appointments, handled my own mail, chose my own routines. Those small acts carried more freedom than any apology ever could. Noah adjusted quickly. Children always do when the rules make sense again. Daniel learned, slowly, what it meant to see instead of assume. Rachel learned too, though her lessons came harder, stripped of shortcuts, because once control is exposed, it can't disguise itself as kindness anymore. There was no victory speech. No applause. Just a quiet evening when I sat with a cup of coffee that tasted the way I liked it, in a room that felt like mine again. The chair didn't wobble. The light stayed on because I wanted it that way. And for the first time in a long while, my presence didn't feel like something that needed managing. They eventually understood what I had learned long before they did. Silence isn't weakness. It's awareness. And when awareness chooses itself, justice doesn't need to be chased. It arrives on its own terms.